A man doesn't just ride into a valley to face down a cattle baron's wrath by accident. He rides in because a choice has been made. A choice between the peace he yearns for and the justice a family deserves. And for the man they would come to know only as Shane, that choice began on a sun-drenched morning in the heart of Wyoming. But let's go back to where it all started. He was a silhouette against the Wyoming sky, a lone rider emerging from the jagged, snow-capped peaks of the Grand Tetons. He moved with a quiet purpose, his buckskin clothes worn and dusty from a long journey. The man's face was unreadable, etched with a past he never spoke of, but his eyes, sharp and alert, missed nothing. They scanned the valley below, a patchwork of green fields and hard-working homesteads, a place of profound peace that seemed a world away from the life he was trying to leave behind. Down in that valley, a boy named Joey Sterrett saw him first. The boy, no older than 10, watched from the porch of his family's small cabin, a speck of civilization in an ocean of wilderness. Strangers were a rarity here, and this one was different. He didn't ride like a ranch hand or a prospector. He rode with a dangerous stillness, his body perfectly balanced on the horse, as if he were a part of it. The rider stopped at the Sterrett's watering trough, dismounting with a fluid grace. Joe's father, Joe Sterrett, emerged from the barn. Joe was a good man, strong and honest, with hands calloused from carving a life out of this stubborn land. He saw the stranger, and his face, usually open and friendly, became cautious. In this valley, you learn to measure a man quickly. "Howdy, stranger," Joe said, his voice even. "You're a long way from anywhere." The rider, Shane, simply nodded. "Looking for a place to water my horse and maybe fill my canteen." His voice was low and quiet, but it carried a weight that made you listen. As he drank, Marion stepped onto the porch. She was the heart of this homestead, a woman of quiet strength and deep kindness. She saw the stranger, and she saw the exhaustion hidden beneath his calm exterior. "Joe," she said softly, "it's almost dinner time. The least we can do is offer him a plate." Joe hesitated for a moment, then nodded. An offer of food was a sacred thing on the frontier, a gesture of trust. Shane accepted with a quiet thank you, and as he sat at their table, the small cabin seemed to hold its breath. He ate with a polite reserve, but his eyes were always moving, taking in the simple warmth of the home, the love between Joe and Marion, the innocent curiosity of their son. He saw a life he thought was only a dream. Later, as Shane prepared to leave, Joe made an offer. "I could use a hand around here. Fencing, clearing stumps. It's hard work, but it's honest." Shane looked at Joe, then at the vast, peaceful valley around him. This was a crossroads. He could get back on his horse and keep riding into nowhere, or he could stay. He could hang up his past, at least for a while, and see what it felt like to build something instead of tearing it down. "I'll stay." And with those two words, the fate of everyone in the valley was sealed. But peace in this valley was a fragile thing. The homesteaders, like the Sterretts, were considered squatters by one man, Rufus Riker. Riker was a cattle baron, a man who believed this entire valley belonged to him by right of first discovery. He saw fences and farms not as insult, but progress. The next day, as Shane and Joe were working to uproot a massive tree stump, Riker and his men rode up. Riker was a hard man, his face a mask of bitter pride. His men were rough, hired hands who enjoyed their work, especially the part that involved intimidation. "Sterrett," Riker's voice cut through the air, "I thought I told you to stop putting down roots. This is cattle country, my country." Joe stood his ground, his hands clenching.
"I've got a deed to this land, Riker. It's mine." Riker's men laughed. One of them, a swaggering cowboy named Calloway, spat on the ground near Joe's feet. "A piece of paper don't mean much out here. We were here first." He turned his attention to Shane, looking at him up and down. "And who's this? Some new farm boy you picked up?" Shane didn't move. He didn't speak. He just watched, his face as calm as a frozen lake. This was the kind of trouble he had ridden so far to escape. He knew how this dance went. A taunt, a shove, and then something worse. Calloway stepped closer to Shane. "What's the matter, farm boy? Cat got your tongue?" Joe took a step forward, ready to defend his new hand, but Shane gave a near imperceptible shake of his head. "Not now. Not here." This was a test. Riker wanted to see if the homesteaders would break, and Shane knew that violence now would only give Riker the excuse he wanted. So Shane stood there and took it. He absorbed the insults, the sneers, the raw intimidation. He let Calloway call him a coward, a sod blotter. For a man like Shane, a man whose past was defined by his refusal to back down, this was a harder fight than any gun battle. It was a fight against himself. Finally, Riker, satisfied for the moment, reined his horse around. "Think it over, Sterrett. This valley ain't big enough for the two of us." As they rode away, their laughter echoed across the fields. Joe Sterrett looked at Shane, not with disappointment, but with a newfound respect. He had seen what Shane had done. He had seen the incredible restraint it took for a man like that not to react. "Thank you," Joe said quietly. Shane just nodded, his eyes on the retreating riders. He knew this wasn't over. He had made a choice to stay, to try for a life of peace. But as he looked at the worried faces, Marion and Joey, he realized that in this valley, peace would have to be fought for. And in the quiet that followed, a promise hung in the air, as heavy and dark as a storm cloud over the Tetons. This was only the beginning.
The days that followed Rufus Riker's visit settled into a quiet rhythm, but the peace was a fragile thing. Shane became a part of the Sterrett farm, his presence as steady and solid as the mountains that watched over them. He worked alongside Joe from sunup to sundown, the clean, hard labor a welcome penance for a past he was determined to bury. He taught young Joey how to properly hold a rifle, not for killing, but for hunting, for survival. His lessons were quiet, his words few, but Joey hung on every one, watching him with an open-mouthed awe that was part admiration and part hero worship. For the first time in a long time, Shane allowed himself to feel the pull of belonging. He saw in the Sterretts a goodness he thought had vanished from the world. He saw the fierce love Joe had for his family and his land, and the quiet, unshakable strength in Marion's gaze. He saw a future, a possibility. But in the back of his mind, the shadow of Rufus Riker lingered, a constant, unspoken threat. The inevitable came on a Saturday. The homesteaders needed to ride into town for supplies. It was a journey they had to make, a necessary risk. As their wagons rolled toward the dusty settlement, the air grew thick with a tension that everyone felt but no one spoke of. The town, with its general store and saloon, was Riker's territory. They finished their business at the store, loading their wagons with flour, salt, and seeds. As they prepared to leave, young Joey looked at Shane with pleading eyes. "Shane, could I get a bottle of soda pop?" Shane looked at the saloon, Grafton's Mercantile, where the soda was sold. He knew what awaited him in there. Riker's men would be there, drinking, waiting. He saw the worry in Marion's eyes, but he also saw the hope in Joey's. It was just a bottle of soda, a small, simple thing, a piece of normalcy in a world that was anything but. "I'll be right back," he said, his voice calm. Shane walked into Grafton's, the swinging doors groaning behind him. The air was thick with the smell of stale whiskey and unwashed men. And just as he expected, Calloway was at the bar, a smirk on his face, surrounded by 5 other Riker hands. They stopped talking when he entered, the room falling silent. Shane ignored them, walking to the bar. "A bottle of soda pop, Mr. Grafton." Calloway slid off his stool and stood in front of him. "Well, look what the cat dragged in. It's the pig farmer. Come to wallow in the mud with the real men?" Shane didn't turn. He placed his coin on the counter. Calloway's voice dripped with venom. "I'm talking to you, sidebuster." Shane took the bottle of soda, turned, and started for the door. Calloway stepped in his way. "I ain't leaving till I say you are." He grabbed the whiskey bottle from the bar. "A farmer should smell like the dirt he digs in." And with that, he poured the raw, burning whiskey down the front of Shane's clean shirt. The insult was absolute. The room was dead silent, waiting for the explosion. They saw the coiled stillness in Shane, the flicker of something cold and dangerous in his eyes, but then it was gone. He looked down at his stained shirt, then back at Calloway, and his face was a mask of calm. He simply walked around him and out the door, leaving Calloway and his men laughing in his wake. He handed the soda to Joey, who saw the dark stain and the look in his eyes. The other homesteaders saw it too. Joe Starrett's hands clenched into fists. "No, Shane," he said, his voice low and hard. "This ain't your fight. It's ours." And in that moment something shifted. The homesteaders, a group of quiet, peaceful farmers, straightened their shoulders. This insult to Shane was an insult to all of them. They had been pushed and threatened for the last time. Led by Joe, they turned and walked back toward the saloon. Shane, seeing their determination, knew he couldn't let them face it alone. He fell into step beside Joe. They walked through the swinging doors together, a silent, determined front. Calloway and his men stopped laughing. They saw Joe Starrett, his face set like granite. They saw the other farmers behind him. And then they saw Shane. And this time, the look in his eyes was different. The calm was still there, but underneath it was a cold, hard fire. "You were saying, Calloway?" Calloway, emboldened by his numbers, sneered. "I was just teaching your pig farmer some manners." That was all it took. Joe's fist shot out, catching Calloway square on the jaw. The room erupted into chaos. It was a raw, brutal brawl. The homesteaders were outnumbered, but they fought with the fury of men defending their homes, their families, their dignity. Joe was a bull, strong and relentless, tossing Riker's men aside. But Shane was something else entirely. He moved with a brutal economy of motion that was terrifying to behold. He wasn't brawling, he was fighting. Every punch was precise, every block perfect. He hit a man, and the man stayed down. He moved through the fight not with anger, but with a cold, detached efficiency, a master of a violent craft he so desperately wanted to forget. He was protecting his friends, and in doing so, he was revealing the very thing he had tried to hide. The fight spilled out into the dusty street. One by one, Riker's men were beaten down, left groaning in the dirt. The homesteaders stood victorious, bruised and bloodied, but unbroken. They had stood together, and they had won. As they nursed their wounds back at the Starrett farm, a new understanding settled among them. They looked at Shane not as a hired hand, but as one of their own. Marion gently cleaned a cut on Shane's face, her touch lingering for a moment, a silent acknowledgment of the terrible price he was willing to pay for their peace. That night, Joey looked at Shane with wide, worshipful eyes. He had seen his quiet friend transform into an unstoppable force, a hero from the dime novels he read. He saw the victory, but Shane knew the truth. He looked out at the darkening valley, and he knew this wasn't an ending. It was an escalation. They had won a fist fight, but Rufus Riker would not answer with fists. He would answer with guns. And the one man Riker would send for, Shane knew, would not be a brawler like Calloway. He would be a man just like himself.
In the days following the saloon fight, a fragile confidence settled over the homesteaders. They had stood their ground together and won. Their victory, however small, felt like a turning point, a sign that their unity could truly stand against Rufus Riker's bullying. They returned to their work with renewed purpose, their conversations filled with a defiant optimism. But Shane did not share their relief. He had seen the look in Riker's eyes as the cattle baron's men were helped from the dirt. It wasn't the look of a man who had learned his lesson. It was the look of a man whose pride had been wounded, and for men like Riker, wounded pride was more dangerous than any fist. While the others celebrated their victory, Shane became more watchful. He spent his evenings on the Starrett's porch, seemingly at ease, but his eyes constantly scanned the horizon, searching the deepening shadows for a threat he knew was coming. He took to cleaning the rifle he used for hunting with a meticulous care that was almost ritualistic, his hands moving with a familiar, practiced grace. Young Joey watched him, sensing the shift in his quiet friend. The dangerous stillness that had always been a part of Shane was now sharper, more present, like the calm before a lightning strike. Miles away, in the bustling cattle town of Cheyenne, Rufus Riker was making a new plan. He sat in a smoke-filled room across from a man who was nothing like the brawlers he employed. This man was quiet, dressed in black, and listened to Riker's proposition with an unnerving reptilian stillness. The man's name was Jack Wilson, and his reputation had preceded him all the way from Kansas. He wasn't a bully or an enforcer. He was a specialist, a man hired for a single, deadly purpose. When Riker finished speaking, Wilson simply smiled, a cold, thin smile that didn't touch his eyes, and shook the cattle baron's hand. The deal was done. A week later, Jack Wilson rode into the valley. He arrived not with a thunder of hooves, but with a chilling quiet. He led his horse down the town's main street, his movements slow and deliberate, his pale eyes taking in every detail. When he walked into Grafton's saloon, the same place the homesteaders had won their victory, the rowdy atmosphere evaporated. Even Riker's men went silent. They knew who he was. They knew what his presence meant. Wilson ordered a whiskey and surveyed the room, his gaze making every man there feel like prey. The news of his arrival spread through the valley like a plague. The homesteaders' newfound confidence began to crumble, replaced by a cold, creeping fear. One of them, a fiery Southerner named Stonewall Tory, refused to be intimidated. He was a proud man, quick to anger, who had fought bravely in the saloon brawl. Against the advice of the others, he rode into town alone, determined to show Riker and his new hired gun that the homesteaders would not be scared off. It was a fatal mistake. Stonewall entered the saloon, his hand hovering near his pistol. Jack Wilson was sitting at a table, calmly cleaning his fingernails with a knife. He looked up as Tory entered, and that cold smile spread across his face. "Well now," Wilson said, his voice a soft, menacing drawl. "It ain't one of the little mud peckers. Heard you Southern boys were good fighters. Guess they were wrong, seeing as how you had to bring a whole flock of dirt scratchers to win one little scuffle." Stonewall's face flushed with anger. "I ain't afraid of you, Wilson." "You should be," Wilson replied, never raising his voice. He stood up slowly, his tall, thin frame uncoiling like a snake. He took a step closer, his eyes fixed on Tory. "Go on home, farmer. The mud on your boots is spoiling the floor." The taunt was designed to be unbearable, a direct attack on Stonewall's honor. The entire saloon watched, holding its breath. Stonewall's hand shook as it rested on the butt of his gun. He was being goaded, expertly and cruelly, into a fight he could not win. "You prove you can back up that talk," Stonewall said, his voice trembling with rage. Wilson's smile widened. "Any time you say." It happened in a heartbeat. Stonewall, blinded by pride and fury, drew his gun, but he never had a chance. Wilson's hand moved with an impossible fluid speed. His pistol was out, fired, and holstered before Stonewall's gun had even cleared his leather. The roar of the gunshot filled the saloon, followed by a deafening silence. Stonewall Torrey stood frozen for a moment, a shocked look of disbelief on his face, before he crumpled to the floor, dead. Wilson looked down at the body without a flicker of emotion, then turned back to the bar. "Anybody else feeling thirsty?" The murder of Stonewall Torrey shattered the homesteader's spirit. This wasn't a fistfight anymore. This was a death sentence. They held a small, somber funeral on a windswept hill overlooking the valley. As the coffin was lowered into the ground, a cold rain began to fall, mirroring the despair on their faces. The talk now was not of fighting, but of leaving, of packing up what little they had and running before Riker and his killer came for them. Joe Starrett tried to hold them together, his voice ringing with a desperate conviction. "We can't run. This land is ours. If we let them scare us off, what are we?" But his words were met with silent, terrified faces of his friends. They had seen what Jack Wilson could do. Shane stood apart from the group, watching the scene unfold. He saw the terror in the eyes of the women, the defeat in the shoulders of the men. He saw Joe's brave but futile attempt to rally them, and he saw Marion, her face pale, holding Joey close as if to shield him from the cold reality that had just descended upon their lives. Shane knew what this was. Wilson wasn't just here to scare the homesteaders. A man like Wilson was a message. Riker had hired him to draw out the one person who truly stood in his way, the quiet man in the buckskin jacket who knew how to fight. Wilson was here for him. That night, the Starrett cabin was filled with a heavy silence. The warmth and hope that had blossomed within its walls felt like a distant memory. After Joe and Marion had gone to bed, Shane walked out to the quiet solitude of the barn. The air was cool and smelled of hay and rain. He walked over to a dark corner where his saddlebags lay. From within, he pulled out his old gun belt. The leather was worn and supple, molded by years of use. The pistol in the holster was a Colt Peacemaker, its metal worn smooth, its balance perfect. He held it in his hands, the familiar weight both a comfort and a curse. This was the life he had tried to bury, the past he had ridden so far to escape. He looked at the gun, the tool of his former trade, and he knew a choice was coming. He could keep it packed away and watch as the family he'd come to care for was destroyed. Or he could strap it on and become the one thing he had sworn he would never be again. He traced the cold steel of the trigger, the silence of the barn pressing in around him, the weight of the future resting in his hands.
The silence of the barn was a heavy shroud. In the dim light, Shane held the gun belt, the worn leather a familiar weight in his hands. This was more than a weapon. It was a symbol of a life he had sworn to leave behind, a life of smoke, death, and lonely trails. He looked back towards the small warm light of the Starrett cabin, a beacon of the peace he had so briefly touched. He thought of Joe's unshakable integrity, Marion's quiet strength, and Joey's innocent, trusting eyes. He knew then that Rufus Riker and his hired killer wouldn't stop until that light was extinguished forever. The choice was never a choice at all. With a slow, deliberate finality, Shane strapped the gun belt around his waist. The Colt Peacemaker settled onto his hip with a familiar, grim comfort. The homesteader was gone. The gunslinger had returned. He stepped out of the barn and saw Joe Starrett by the corral, saddling his horse. Joe's face was a mask of cold fury. "It's my fight, Shane," Joe said, his voice low and hard. "My land, my family. I'm going into town. I'm going to face them." He knew what that meant. It was a suicide mission,
Joe was a strong man, a brave man, but he was no match for a killer like Jack Wilson. "You can't," Shane said quietly. "I have to," Joe retorted, his jaw set. "This is my responsibility." "And what about Marion? And Joey? Is leaving them alone your responsibility too?" The words hit Joe like a physical blow, but he didn't back down. He moved to push past Shane, and in that moment the two friends stood as obstacles to one another. "Get out of my way, Shane." What happened next was a blur of motion, a fight born not of anger, but of a terrible, loving necessity. Shane struck Joe a single, precise blow, but Joe, fueled by a farmer's strength and a husband's righteous fury, fought back. They grappled in the dirt of the corral, a desperate, clumsy struggle. It wasn't a saloon brawl. It was a painful, heartbreaking conflict between two men who respected each other deeply. But one was a farmer, and the other was a professional. Shane found his opening and struck Joe hard at the base of the skull. Joe crumpled to the ground, unconscious but unharmed. Marion ran from the house, her face etched with fear, a half-stifled cry on her lips. She saw Joe on the ground, and then looked at Shane, who stood breathing heavily over his friend, and in his eyes she saw the whole terrible truth. She saw the sacrifice he was about to make. "You're not coming back," she whispered, her voice breaking. It wasn't a question. "I am," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard. He looked at her, and for a fleeting moment the gunslinger vanished, and she saw only the man, a man who was saying goodbye to the only home he had ever known. "Tell Joe, tell him I was just too much for him." He looked at the unconscious farmer with a deep, sorrowful affection. "Tell him I'm sorry." He turned to his horse, but Marion's voice stopped him. "Please, Shane, be careful." The words were a prayer, a desperate plea against the inevitable. He simply nodded, mounted his horse, and rode out into the encroaching darkness without looking back. His ride to town was a journey into the past. With every beat of his horse's hoofs, the quiet homesteader was stripped away, leaving only the cold, focused calm of the man who had survived countless dangers. The town was quiet, but it was the silence of a held breath. As he dismounted in front of Grafton's saloon, the swinging doors opened, and he saw them. Rufus Riker stood on the second-floor balcony, looking down like a Roman emperor, and at the bar stood Jack Wilson, a black-clad specter of death, that cold, predatory smile playing on his lips. He walked into the saloon. The air was thick with tension. Every man in the room knew that this was the final act. "I was hoping you'd come," Wilson said, his voice a soft drawl. He turned slowly from the bar. "I'm here," Shane replied, his voice even. His eyes never left Wilson, but he spoke to the man on the balcony. "I've got a message for you, Riker." "I'm not interested in messages," Riker sneered. "You'll hear this one," Shane said. "The homesteaders are staying. You've played your hand. Now it's over." Wilson laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "The only thing that's over, my friend, is you." The world seemed to slow down. Shane saw the flicker of intent in Wilson's pale eyes, the subtle shift of his shoulders. He saw the beginning of the draw. And then time exploded. 2 gunshots roared as one, a deafening blast of smoke and fire that ripped through the saloon's silence. Wilson stood for a moment, his confident smile replaced by a look of pure, utter shock before he was thrown backward by the force of the bullet, crashing dead into the tables behind him. Silence. Then, from the balcony above, Riker, his face a mask of fury, drew his own pistol. But Shane was already moving, turning, firing a second shot upwards. Riker staggered back, clutching his chest,
and fell from the balcony without a sound. It was over. The threat that had terrorized the valley was gone. Shane stood in the smoke, a wound high on his side beginning to bleed. He turned and walked out of the saloon, back into the night. He was mounting his horse when a small voice cried out from the darkness, "Shane!" Joey Starrett ran towards him, his face streaked with tears. He had followed him. He had seen it all. "You beat them, Shane! I knew you could!" Shane looked down at the boy, his face softening. "I have to go now, Joey." "But why, Shane? We need you. Pa needs you." Shane leaned down from his saddle, the pain from his wound evident on his face. "A man has to be what he is. You can't break the mold. I tried, and it didn't work for me." "We want you, Shane," the boy pleaded. Shane's voice was a low, pained whisper. "There's no living with a killing, Joey. There's no going back from it. Right or wrong, it's a brand, and that brand sticks." He looked towards the Starrett farm, a place he could see in his mind but never return to. "You go home to your mother and your father, and you tell them that there aren't any more guns in the valley." He straightened up in his saddle and turned his horse toward the mountains. "Shane!" Joey's voice was a desperate cry, an echo that would haunt the valley for years. "Come back!" But Shane didn't look back. He rode on, a lone, wounded figure slumped over his horse, heading up into the dark, jagged peaks of the Tetons, disappearing back into the wilderness from which he came. The boy's final cries faded into the wind, a heartbreaking farewell to the man who had saved them, a hero who had to leave in order to let them live in peace. The legend of Shane was born in his arrival, but it was immortalized in his departure.